When I die and am cut open, they will see the image of Philip engraved in my heart. This realm shall know a queen's unwavering hand.
Hey guys. Tonight, we will delve into the dark mystery of Mary I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, who ascended the throne under the title Bloody Mary and departed in a rotting body so grotesque that history tried to conceal it. You will hear about her journey from being the Pearl of England to her dream of restoring Catholicism with the flames of heresy. Then witness how she burned nearly 300 people alive and ultimately became a living corpse with sallow yellow skin, a distended belly, and an indescribable stench. What rendered the physicians of the Renaissance helpless before that cruel cancer? What medical secrets lie hidden in those ancient manuscripts? And you will not survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And now, leave a comment to let me know where you are watching from and what the local time is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the winter of 1558, under the gloomy atmosphere of St. Louis, James's palace, the flickering candlelight barely illuminated the royal quarters, where the great lords whispered among themselves about the horrifying appearance of Queen Mary Tudor. She, proudly known as Mary I, born in 1516 as the only daughter of Emperor Henry VIII, an astute and ruthless ruler, and Queen Catherine of Aragon, celebrated for her filial piety and unshakable faith. Mary grew up alongside her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth I, in a world of power and ceremony, where most outsiders only saw the glittering facade, unaware that the sisters' hearts would bear wounds inflicted not only by history, but also by the machinations of the royal court. From her earliest childhood, Mary was nicknamed the Pearl of England for her pure beauty and gentle demeanour. She was educated by Europe's foremost scholars, becoming fluent in Latin, French, and even Italian, while gaining deep knowledge of theology and politics. Beneath the centuries-old oak tree behind the palace, she and her sister would read scripture and dream of a prosperous, peaceful kingdom, where the Catholic faith reigned supreme. This childhood closeness forged an unbreakable bond between them, even though fate would later place the two on opposing extremes. However, Mary's life took a dark turn when her father, in his quest for a male heir, decided to divorce Catherine. Mary was suddenly stripped of her princess title, labelled illegitimate, and lost every privilege from her own chambers to the right to wear regal vestments. Young Mary was relegated to the court's inner circle as a maid to Princess Elizabeth I, forced to witness her mother's exile and endure rumours of poisoning until Catherine's death. From a little girl basking in royal pride, Mary became a lonely adolescent adrift, soon experiencing profound grief and resentment. Those wounds were not only scratches on her soul, but etched themselves into her body in excruciating headaches and recurring menstrual disorders. By the age of 16, she was already battling depression and anxiety. Her constitution weakened and her resistance sapped. Yet Mary clung to her Catholic faith more fervently than ever, believing that only God could comfort her and deliver justice. This faith became her guiding torch, but would also ignite into fanaticism in the years to come. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, Mary was cast completely to the political margins. Her psychological prison narrowed further as close friends were stripped of their positions and factional conflicts intensified. Mary witnessed the persecution of Catholics, heard the screams rising from the flames, and smelled the acrid sting of burning flesh. This was the start of the darkest chapter in her mind, nurturing a hatred of the reformers and fueling her desire to restore religious order at any cost. Then, in 1553, after the brief reign of Jane Grey, Mary was formally placed on the throne, becoming the first queen to rule under the title Mary I. She was 37 years old, a considered age for a medieval woman, but in the public eye she radiated iron resolve to restore Catholicism. London's court once again buzzed with elaborate ceremony, yet the winter's chill still lingered in her thoughts, reminding her of past humiliations and her life's mission. It was in that same winter of 1558, when her power and the Catholic faith were at their zenith, that Mary began to endure her greatest challenge, a cruel disease that even the Renaissance physicians could not explain, turning her body into a destructive tumour. Her once smooth skin faded into a greyish yellow like old parchment. Her belly swelled uncontrollably, and soft flesh broke open with necrotic sores, even as she drew breath. Hour by hour, minute by minute, the royal flesh decayed before the court's eyes, transforming Mary from a majestic queen into a living coffin. Mugwort and incense were burned everywhere to mask the putrefaction, but nothing could erase the harrowing impression of a body rotting from within. Whispers in the royal corridors rose in panic. What dreadful disease is the queen enduring now? The name Bloody Mary, long associated with the flames she ordered against heretics, became even more chilling as her own flesh was burned from the inside. Stripped of power and beauty, Mary was left only with despair. Imprisoned in the cold chamber of destiny, the choked sobs, the swirling incense smoke, and the pervasive horror marked the beginning of the ultimate tragedy in Mary Tudor's life, a tragedy of disintegration, both physical and spiritual. After the initial days of courtly shock, Mary Tudor continued to endure unrelenting torment. The vicious illness, what modern physicians speculate was either uterine cancer or liver cancer, had transformed her body into a living prison. Mary's abdomen swelled so grotesquely that members of the court whispered she was carrying a devil's child. The physicians, at a loss, cut away the bandages, applied salves to the wounds, and wrapped them anew, only to further injure her delicate flesh. Each time they changed the dressings, the stench of rot rose in waves, forcing the palace to burn incense constantly to mask the odour. Mary's agonized screams echoed through the corridors, intensifying the tragedy of a fading monarch. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of power, had become hollow, vacant as though her soul had departed. Her skin, als fair, took on a yellowish hue tinged with green, oozing in patches until many physicians turned away. All were powerless, as the woman who had once ruled a kingdom appeared before them as a living corpse, desperately seeking a moment of peace amid her bodily hell. The flames Mary had once used to purge heresy now raged within her own organs. No prayer could extinguish the necrotic fire spreading across her body. Religious ceremonies meant to comfort her only deepened her despair, for she believed her faith itself was being tested. In delirium, Mary demanded Mass be said at her bedside, convinced that a miracle could spare her from decay. The contradiction between absolute power and utter helplessness before disease became stark. The queen who had ordered hundreds to the stake was now powerless as her own flesh consumed itself. Even with all their Renaissance knowledge, her physicians could only recommend herbal concoctions, and a bleeding knife believed to balance the four humours, but in truth only further weakened her. Every experimental remedy was tried on her body, accelerating the rot. St. James's Palace became a living hell. Its ornate chambers now reeked of decay. The constant hiss of incense replaced every other sound, and every laboured breath rang with fearful anticipation. Mary, who had once walked red carpets with confidence, lay helpless in her bed, her body emaciated. Anyone who entered saw only a shattered form, an object lesson in the fragile limits of power before an unstoppable disease. In her darkest hours, she endured not just physical agony, but mental torture. Mary whispered hurried prayers to her physicians, begging God for a moment's respite. Yet all efforts were in vain. Medical wards were set up beside her private chamber, with attendants on watch day and night to record symptoms, take her temperature, and monitor her pulse. Yet their records served only to underscore the tragedy, cataloguing her cries and convulsions. The treatments themselves added to Mary's suffering. Acidic fluid was drawn from her abdomen without sterile instruments, causing fresh waves of pain with each insertion of a metal tube. She would collapse, her eyes red-rimmed, her lips trembling as she invoked priests to administer the Eucharist, searching for a promise of salvation. In delirium, Mary even stripped herself to display her wounds to onlookers, convinced that public pity might translate into a miracle during frigid nights. Attendants massaged her with scented oils and medicinal spirits, but the pleasant aroma could never overcome the stench of decay, forcing her closest guards to don cloth masks whenever they approached. Velvet draperies, meant to keep out the cold, served only to conceal festering sores. Even the most dutiful courtiers hesitated to disturb her during convulsions, and the palace air grew heavy and oppressive, driving many to insomnia and dread. Mary's agony was not merely a personal tragedy, but a warning to the Tudor dynasty that strength and invincibility are illusions when one confronts death. Each time she murmured for an analgesic, her physicians witnessed the futility of contemporary medicine. They were haunted by the sight of their queen, once feared by heretics, now, like a poisonous mercury statue, slowly moving toward inevitable demise. When her pain reached its apex, Mary erupted in delirious screams as if calling out to an unseen enemy. Her cries reverberated through the palace, sending shivers down the spine of every servant. Soldiers hurried to her chamber, only to recoil in alarm at the sight before them. No longer Mary Tudor, but an unrecognizable figure ravaged by disease. There were no hymns of praise, no radiant glory, only pain and the spectre of death. Finally, amid swirling incense and whispered prayers, Mary Tudor came to understand that the crown could neither deliver salvation nor free her from agony. In her heart, she must have inscribed a bitter truth, that even a queen of Tudor blood remains vulnerable before an incurable affliction. Mary Tudor was born in 1516, amid the admiration of the English court as the cherished daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. From her earliest days, she was enveloped in royal ceremony, provided with a first-class education, and lauded with praise as the Pearl of England. Yet that happiness evaporated swiftly when Henry VIII insisted upon a male heir. At the age of 8, Mary's parents' marriage was annulled. She was stripped of every royal privilege, branded illegitimate, and forced to serve her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth I. This sudden fall from grace carved an indelible scar upon Mary's spirit. She was forbidden from seeing her mother, Catherine, who lived in exile until her death. Amid rumours that she had been poisoned, the court circulated vicious gossip, and the king's agents trailed Mary's every step. Even her letters were intercepted and censored. On more than one occasion, she narrowly avoided charges of treason when she refused to acknowledge her father's new marriage. The shame, fear, and isolation drove Mary into a private darkness, turning a once gentle princess into a wary young woman, ever suspecting betrayal in every glance. This period of royal confinement exacted a heavy toll on Mary's mind and body. She suffered frequent migraines and severe menstrual irregularities from an early age. These ailments persisted throughout her life, weakening her constitution and laying the groundwork for the malignant growth that would later consume her. In the suffocating atmosphere of court exile, Mary turned more fervently to her Catholic faith. She attended Mass despite warnings from courtiers and trembling fear, believing that only absolute devotion to the Church could heal the wounds inflicted upon her heart. That tragic journey of broken promises and lost innocence nurtured a profound resentment toward the reformist factions. Mary swore to restore Catholicism and to punish the leaders of heresy with merciless severity, an oath that would presage her brutal reign. From the image of a poised and gentle princess, she transformed into a determined, bloodthirsty, and fanatical queen, a living testament to childhood, crushed by political intrigue, and a spirit that could find no peace. In those formative years, Mary's relationship with Princess Elizabeth I became a complex mixture of sisterly affection and deep mistrust. Though they had read scripture side by side under the ancient oak at Greenwich Palace, they were soon cast as rivals by the shifting ambitions of court factions. Elizabeth's sleek hair and nimble wit contrasted painfully with Mary's melancholic disposition and the frequent pallor of her skin. Yet Mary clung to memories of their childhood closeness, even as envy and suspicion racked her soul. Mary's exile also inflicted lasting psychological damage. Isolated from friends and forbidden any honest companionship, she turned inward, her mind replaying every humiliation. At night, she lay awake listening to the muffled laughter of courtiers behind heavy tapestries. Imagining plots against her life, she dreamed of her mother's gentle voice, reading psalms, only to awaken to the stark reality of her own unlit chamber. These sleepless nights bred a growing sense that pity and mercy were weaknesses to be eradicated, an idea that would manifest tragically in her later policies. Meanwhile, Mary's physical health deteriorated under the weight of chronic stress and untreated ailments. She endured endless consultations with physicians who offered little beyond leeching and emetic concoctions. The ritual of bloodletting at the elbow, believed to balance the four humours, left her faint and frail. Yet she allowed these painful procedures, convinced that her suffering might bring her closer to divine favour. Each bruise and incision became proof of her sacrifice, fueling a dangerous conviction that she had earned a sacred mission to purify England. Despite the trauma, Mary's intellect and piety grew sharper. She mastered theological debate, challenging Protestant preachers in private disputations. Her letters from this time reveal a woman of deep learning and unshakable faith qualities that her enemies would later brand as fanaticism. Courtiers wrote of her midnight vigils, poring over Vulgate manuscripts by candlelight, her eyes bright with conviction even as her body trembled. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Mary had become a figure both pitiable and formidable. She moved through the corridors of Whitehall with a quiet dignity, her once luminous cheeks now hollowed by grief and determination. Her hands, once soft from the ministrations of gentle courtiers, were hardened by years of secret prayer and private study. The world saw only a displaced princess, but behind her calm exterior lay a simmering resolve to reclaim what she believed was her divine birthright. This crucible of childhood suffering and exile ultimately shaped Mary Tudor into the monarch she would become. The wounds of her heart inflicted by annulment, exile, and familial betrayal fused with the scars of her body, forging a monarch unyielding in her quest for religious restoration. In that crucible, the gentle Pearl of England was transformed into a queen determined to wield power with iron resolve, willing to sacrifice compassion at the altar of faith. Thus, the legacy of Mary's early life stands as a testament to the profound impact of childhood trauma on leadership. Her formative years of humiliation and isolation sowed the seeds of both her fierce piety and her merciless intolerance. From the bright promise of royal youth to the anxious shadows of exile, Mary Tudor's journey underscores how the fragile beginnings of a princess can evolve into the austere, uncompromising rule of a queen. In 1544, after nearly 2 decades of spiritual exile, Mary was finally recognized by her father as the heir to the throne. Her joy, however, was tempered by the realities of age and infirmity. At 70 years old, Henry VIII could only view Mary as a conduit for a Catholic alliance with Spain. Then, in 1553, following the brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, Mary ascended the throne at 37 years old, an age considered old for a medieval woman. From the moment she took power, Mary placed her ambition to restore Catholicism above all else. She issued decrees reinstating the rites of the Mass, returned authority to the clergy, and hunted down adherents of the Protestant faith. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 individuals were condemned as heretics and burned before the public eye, leaving a horrifying scar on English society. Mary believed that these purifying flames would cleanse the nation's sins and secure God's grace. Alongside her religious campaign, Mary nurtured her dream of producing a Catholic heir. She married Philip II of Spain, a prince 11 years, her junior, hoping to cement the alliance and ensure the dynasty's Catholic future. The wedding itself was cold and sombre, resembling more a funeral than a celebration. Yet Mary invested her full trust and hope in this union, convinced that it would yield a Catholic successor to uphold her spiritual mission. Ironically, Mary's failing health, ravaged by the internal disease that had haunted her final years, prevented any semblance of marital intimacy. As her internal tumours grew, debilitating pain and physical weakness rendered her unable to engage in conjugal relations day after day. She clung to hope as her abdomen swelled, and the court dared to dream of a miracle. Each time her physicians, fearful of contradicting their queen, affirmed her pregnancy, only to reveal in private their doubts. Mary plunged further into despair. The absurdity of false hope drove her to the brink of hysteria. She spent hours in prayer, begging for divine intervention, convinced that this trial was God's way of testing her faith. Yet each disappointment eroded her sanity, pushing her deeper into fanaticism. Mary came to believe that Protestant conspirators were actively thwarting God's grace, cementing her conviction that only through the eradication of heresy could she secure the heavenly favour needed to conceive. Mary's relentless pursuit of a Catholic heir underscored the tragic irony of her bloodline. Born into privilege and destined for glory, she found herself trapped by her own body's betrayal. The same womb that should have produced a son to carry on the Tudor line instead hosted a crushing symbol of her failure. Each swell of her belly, each pang of pain, echoed the cruel twist of fate that denied her both legacy and relief. Meanwhile, Philip II remained a distant figure, preoccupied with his Spanish dominions. His absence deepened Mary's sense of isolation. She wrote fervent letters pleading for his comfort and assistance, but they went largely unanswered. In her palace chamber, Mary confronted the ultimate mockery, that the political marriage meant to secure Catholic succession instead magnified her solitude and suffering. As the years of false pregnancies continued, Mary's court became a theatre of collective delusion. Advisors whispered reassurances. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their sovereigns with cautious optimism, and wet nurses were hired in expectation of a royal birth. Yet behind the scenes, physicians and maidens in waiting exchanged weary glances, their silence complicit in prolonging Mary's torment. Her emotional turmoil manifested in increasingly erratic behaviour. She alternated between fervent optimism, issuing proclamations of thanksgiving for her divine pregnancy, and crushing despair, accusing her closest counsellors of betrayal. In moments of fragile lucidity, Mary confessed in private to her confessor that she feared God's judgment more than death itself, believing that her inability to produce an heir was a punishment for past sins. This inner conflict between political duty and bodily failure defined Mary's reign. She had returned England to the Catholic fold with sweeping legislative power, only to be undermined by the very vessel meant to secure her legacy. Her subjects, initially awed by her piety and determination, grew sceptical, as each hopeful announcement dissolved into disillusionment. For Mary, the cruelty of prophecy was realized, that a queen who wielded life and death power over her subjects could not guarantee the continuance of her own line. By 1558, Mary's health had deteriorated to the point where even her closest attendants dared not approach without masks to shield themselves from her illness. The palace walls echoed less with the pomp of court ceremonies, and more with the hush of anxious whispers. The dream of a Catholic heir became an apparition, haunting yet unattainable, marking the ultimate irony of her reign. In the end, Mary's dreams of dynastic succession and religious restoration were undone not by rebellion or invasion, but by the inescapable limits of her own flesh, her legacy would not be a Catholic heir, but a cautionary tale of how bloodlines and ambition can be cruelly betrayed by the vulnerabilities of the human body. Thus, the Queen who sought to shape England's destiny through divine fire found her final chapter written not in the birth of a prince, but in the silent echo of a throne left without an heir. The failures of the two phantom pregnancies, in 1556 and 1557, plunged Mary Tudor into a severe crisis. Rumours spread across England of the Queen bent double, silently weeping over her swollen abdomen and pleading with God for deliverance. The chaos within her marriage mirrored this personal disaster. Philip, the Second of Spain, increasingly distanced himself, spending prolonged periods in his homeland, leaving Mary alone to confront a body that was rotting and a mind ravaged by despair. His absence intensified her isolation and fueled her paranoia, convincing her that even her own court conspired to destroy her Catholic ambitions. The wrath that flowed through Mary's veins now erupted in the most ruthless purge of heresy in English history. Every execution she ordered was meticulously overseen, sermons delivered before the flames, supplemental tortures inflicted to break the condemned, and detailed correspondence with bishops to ensure no soul was spared. Mary believed wholeheartedly that these burnings both affirmed true faith and saved the condemned souls. Under her command, over 280 individuals perished in public pyres, an image seared into the national consciousness and igniting waves of fear and outrage. Amid these religious persecutions, Mary's malignant tumour crept silently through her skeleton. In her final days, she bore unending agony, her skin ulcerated and wept pus. Her fingers darkened into leathery blackness, and her eyes, once bright with regal command, now appeared dull and vacant. She clung to every whispered prayer as a flicker of hope, yet remained submerged in bodily torment. The court descended into turmoil as the Queen's authority waned, leaving only the hollow shell of a living corpse in place of the sovereign they once revered. On the 17th of November, in 1558, when she was 42 years old, Mary Tudor succumbed, bringing to a close both a personal and national tragedy. Her body began to decompose almost immediately, even while still warm, emitting an overpowering stench that forced St. James's Palace to seal its doors for days. This death did more than end a bloody reign. It stood as a stark warning of the brutal power of cancer and the fragility of royal authority when faced with an unstoppable disease. In the aftermath of her passing, courtiers who had once attended her with reverence now recoiled at the sight of her corpse. The Queen who had so confidently ruled England now lay entombed in decay skin, hardened in parts like mummified parchment. Other areas softened into putrefaction. The relentless smell of rot permeated the corridors, making normal funeral rites impossible indoors. Many of Mary's personal effects, tapestries, furnishings, even her garments were burned or discarded. So thoroughly had the odour saturated every fibre. Physicians performed what passed for a primitive autopsy, revealing organs ravaged by malignant growths that had almost entirely replaced healthy tissue. Officially, her cause of death was recorded diplomatically as natural causes, but the horrifying reality went far beyond polite euphemism. Those who prepared her heart for burial noted that it, too, had been partially consumed by the same disease, as if the very organ devoted to her Catholic mission had been devoured by the malignancy that destroyed her. News of Mary's death travelled swiftly to Philip II in Spain, eliciting a response characterized more by political calculation than mourning. He immediately dispatched emissaries to begin negotiations with Elizabeth I's representatives, securing his influence in England while offering only perfunctory condolences for his late wife. In London, the atmosphere shifted overnight. The long shadow of Marian persecutions lifted, releasing Protestant exiles to return and dismantling the structures Mary had erected. The ultimate irony of Mary's demise was not lost on contemporaries. The queen who had wielded life and death power over hundreds was powerless to halt her own demise. Her reign ended not with a triumphant proclamation or final words, but in silent dissolution, her authority dissolving as inexorably as her flesh, in death, as in life. Mary Tudor became a symbol of the sudden reversal of fortune that can befall even those born to the highest rank. Mary's funeral, held days later in Westminster Abbey, was a subdued affair. Protocol demanded a royal ceremony, but Chenuina mourners were few. The pallbearers, men bound by duty rather than devotion, bore her coffin past silent congregations, whose hushed respect mixed uneasily with relief that her suffering was at an end. No triumphant requiem marked her passage. Instead, an uneasy quiet fell over the abbey, as if England itself breathed a collective exhale. Thus closed the tragic chapter of Mary Tudor's life. Her death served as a powerful instruction on the merciless nature of disease and the ultimate impotence of worldly power. In the annals of English history, the story of the queen who sought to purify her realm in flames and died in the horrors of her own decaying flesh endures as a harrowing testament to the dangers of religious fanaticism and the inescapable reality of human mortality. Immediately upon Mary Tudor drawing her final breath on the 17th of November in 1558, the entirety of English governance plunged into disarray. Her last proclamations continued to bear the royal seal, though her voice had grown so weak it could scarcely be heard above a whisper. Courtiers hesitated each time they knelt before her bier, fearful of confronting the ravaged visage of the queen. Beyond the palace walls, the word of Mary's passing spread swiftly through every town and shire. The populace, long haunted by the memory of the Marian burnings, found their dread momentarily abated. None wished to dwell further in the shadow of a rotting throne. Within days, Princess Elizabeth I, Mary's half-sister, who had once served as her maid of honour, was proclaimed queen at Westminster Abbey. The palace, draped in sombre splendour, prepared for the coronation. Yet the atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the dark rigidity of Mary's reign. Elizabeth ascended with caution, fully aware that the nation's wounds remained fresh and unhealed. On her first day of rule, she issued a royal injunction to suspend all heresy trials and granted amnesty to those condemned but not yet executed. Within that inaugural week, hundreds of Protestant refugees and relatives of the Marian martyrs quietly returned, their subdued joy signalling a collective sigh of relief. However, the transition of power proved far from smooth. Many high-ranking officials still loyal to the old Catholic regime sought to delay the implementation of Elizabeth's decrees. They raised banners according to the old ceremonies, invoking the indestructibility of the Catholic faith and challenging the authority of the new queen. Confronted with this resistance, Elizabeth I leveraged her personal charisma to win over influential figures. She promised reconciliation and the restoration of order, inviting both Protestant and Catholic leaders to consult at the Privy Council. This gesture laid the foundation for her policy of via media, a middle way designed to temper religious extremism and preserve national unity. During these critical days, Elizabeth I's image, radiant with calm assurance, stood in marked contrast to Mary's severity. She deftly practiced what might be called domestic colonial diplomacy, quietly assessing support within the court and gradually fortifying her claim to the throne. Her appearances on the balcony of Whitehall Palace drew cheers and applause, a stark departure from the fearful silence that had greeted Mary's processional entries. Sermons across the realm extolled the virtue of mercy and the promise of national healing, underscoring the hope that Elizabeth's reign represented a new chapter for England. Elizabeth I moved quickly to solidify her religious settlement. She reintroduced the Act of Supremacy, proclaiming herself Supreme Governor of the Church of England, while simultaneously authorizing the Act of Uniformity, which mandated a single Book of Common Prayer. These measures offered a compromise, retaining many traditional rituals appealing to Catholics, yet affirming a Protestant theological framework. This pragmatic approach aimed to satisfy neither extreme entirely, but to establish a stable ecclesiastical structure acceptable to the majority. It was a delicate balancing act that would shape English religious life for generations. Internationally, Elizabeth I's accession signalled a shift in diplomatic alignments. Spain, previously Mary's staunch ally through her marriage to Philip II, adopted a wait-and-see posture. French envoys, long concerned by Mary's pro-Spanish stance, cautiously extended their congratulations, eager to explore possibilities for renewed cooperation. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire acknowledged Elizabeth's rule with guarded optimism, conscious that England's religious policies would impact continental politics. In each correspondence, Elizabeth's tone blended firmness with courtesy, reinforcing her image as a sovereign devoted to both majesty and magnanimity. At home, the Queen's benevolent gestures resonated with the populace. Parish churches thronged with worshippers, as priests preached reconciliation rather than persecution. In villages and towns, citizens hid tokens in their windowsills, sprigs of rosemary to symbolize remembrance of past martyrs, and sprigs of rosemary to celebrate the dawn of forgiveness. Town criers spread news of the new peace, and even those who had fled under Mary's fires returned to exchange old grievances for cautious optimism. The ritual of communal repentance and renewal became as much a part of Elizabeth's early reign as the ecclesiastical reforms themselves. To address the lingering loyalties to Rome, Elizabeth I convened a general council of clergy at Lambeth Palace. Representatives of both camps discussed theological nuances, but more importantly, affirmed their joint commitment to the nation's well-being. Though disagreements persisted, the Council's public declarations of unity proved vital in reducing the risk of insurrection. By positioning herself as the ultimate arbiter, Elizabeth ensured that the Church of England maintained continuity with English tradition while distancing itself from papal authority. In secular governance, Elizabeth I sought to integrate former Marian officials who pledged loyalty to her government. She recognized that stability required administrative continuity, even among those tainted by association with the persecutions. Many former Catholic appointees were retained in non-ecclesiastical roles, provided they swore the oath of supremacy. This pragmatic inclusion prevented a power vacuum and underscored Elizabeth's willingness to forgive past transgressions in the interest of national solidarity. As winter gave way to spring, London and other cities celebrated with festivals commemorating the new era. The Queen appeared in processions, flanked by both Protestant and Catholic dignitaries, a visual testament to her reconciliatory vision. Plays and masks in court theatres echoed themes of redemption and renewal, reflecting Elizabeth I's aspiration to unite her subjects under a shared identity, rather than divide them by doctrinal strife. Thus, Elizabeth I's accession marked the end of a bloody chapter and the beginning of a transformative age for England. Her careful blend of political acumen, religious compromise, and gracious leadership not only secured her throne, but also steered the nation from the fanaticism of the Marian persecutions toward a constructive spirit of reconciliation. In that delicate interlude, England began its metamorphosis from a realm torn by sectarian hatred into a unified kingdom poised for its golden age. Under the reign of Mary Tudor, thousands of Protestant believers were forced to flee England, seeking refuge in the cities of Switzerland, Germany, France, and the Netherlands. They were stripped of their land, had their assets seized, and left behind families who suffered reprisals. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, a wave of homecoming occurred in late 1558 and early 1559. The ports of Dover, Southampton, and London overflowed with ships bearing returning exiles, carrying with them capital, professional skills, and first-hand experience of religious liberty. This return was far more than a mere homecoming. These exiles brought with them a renewed zeal for freedom of conscience, forming the backbone of the new Protestant community. Many merchant families restored overseas trading routes in textile, shipping, and wine, revitalizing commerce that had stagnated under Mary Tudor's persecutions. The advanced printing techniques they introduced from Germany enabled low-cost production of Protestant texts, accelerating the spread of Reform doctrine. Craftsmen among them reopened tailoring shops, blacksmith forges, and shipyards, breathing life back into the bustling markets of English towns. However, the reception of returnees was not without tension. Some long-standing Catholic officials, still mourning Mary Tudor's religious restoration, feared that the seasoned exiles would impose new pressures toward extreme Protestantism, even to the point of overturning the remains of Marian policies. To manage this delicate reintegration, Elizabeth I and her Privy Council issued regulations for land grants, financial assistance for rebuilding homes, and guarantees of personal security and religious freedom. Former Catholic convents and monasteries were repurposed. Some became meeting houses for Protestant congregations. Others transformed into schools to educate the young in weeks of biblical instruction. The return of the exiles marked a profound economic and social turning point. London and other port cities brimmed with foreign goods, raw wool, and finished cloth from the Low Countries, Bohemian glassware, and Dutch printed inks. These imports not only diversified consumer choice, but stimulated local industry to match continental standards. Small religious gatherings took place in private homes, where lay preachers delivered sermons in English rather than Latin for the first time before polite society. These conversations fostered a new culture of engagement, permitting lay people to question doctrine and participate directly in theological discourse. As these new Protestant assemblies grew, they began to organize into distinct congregations, electing elders and deacons to oversee charitable works and mutual aid. Elizabeth I's government recognized these structures, granting them legal standing in exchange for loyalty oaths to the crown. This official recognition provided stability and encouraged moderate voices that rejected the violent zeal once tolerated under Mary Tudor. A balance emerged between freedom of worship and civic order, enabling diverse strands of Protestant belief to coexist without immediate threat of sectarian conflict. Meanwhile, immigrants from the continent introduced guild practices that strengthened local craftsmanship. Huguenot silk weavers set up workshops in Spitalfields, training English apprentices in advanced weaving techniques. Dutch clockmakers relocated to Westminster, establishing the beginnings of a precision engineering industry that would flourish in later decades. The exchange of skills bridged cultural divides and fostered a genuine sense of shared prosperity. As Puritan leaders returned from Geneva and Frankfurt, they set up printing presses capable of producing Bibles and psalm books in quantity, fueling both devotional life and literacy. The social impact of this return extended even to the countryside. Landowners who had rented out exile properties under Mary Tudor now faced appeals from original owners to reclaim ancestral farms. Elizabeth I's Council devised a land restitution scheme, compensating those who had purchased confiscated estates while acknowledging the rights of dispossessed families. Though imperfect, this settlement laid the groundwork for a more equitable system of tenure, reducing rural tensions and preventing large-scale peasant unrest. Culturally, the fusion of English and continental influences gave rise to notable innovations. The Inns of Court saw debates on religious tolerance, alongside developments in English common law. Early amateur theatrical performances incorporated themes of exile and return, reflecting the nation's trauma and hope. In universities, chairs in modern languages and printing studies emerged, reflecting the practical needs of an outward-looking society. The flowering of arts and letters during this period can be traced directly to the influx of skill, capital, and intellectual energy provided by the returning Protestant exiles. By the end of 1560, the transformed fabric of English society had taken shape. The merchant class regained confidence. The printing industry boomed, and new forms of lay religious participation took root. Elizabeth I, bolstered by the return of those forced into exile, entered a phase of remarkable cultural flourishing, what would later be celebrated as the Elizabethan Age. In retrospect, The homecoming of the exiles stands as one of the most pivotal episodes in the nation's recovery, a reminder that exile can engender resilience, creativity, and ultimately, renewal. Thus, the return of these exiled lives under Elizabeth I did not simply repatriate individuals, it reknit the social, economic, and spiritual fabric of England. In the crucible of persecution and exile, a new England emerged, one more diverse, industrious, and committed to the principles of religious freedom and civic cooperation that would define the golden era to come. Elizabeth I's policy of religious reconciliation laid the groundwork for a swift revival of both domestic and international commerce. Principal markets in London, Bristol, and York gradually buzzed with renewed activity. Merchants specializing in Spanish merino wool and Bohemian crystal ramped up their import-export operations, reviving trade routes once severed under Mary Tudor. The newly invigorated East India and Northeast Asia trading companies re-established long-distance voyages that had languished during the Marian persecutions. As customs revenue surged, Elizabeth I's coffers filled, enabling her government to invest in the Royal Navy, expand England's maritime reach, and fortify coastal defences against foreign threats. On the diplomatic front, Elizabeth I, a delicate balancing act with Philip II of Spain, Mary Tudor's cold and calculating husband, now alternately a potential ally or dangerous adversary depending on religious developments. To navigate this complexity, Elizabeth I dispatched envoys to Madrid, emphasizing her stance of religious neutrality and proposing a mutually beneficial commercial treaty. Philip II consented to maintain cordial relations in exchange for Elizabeth I's discreet toleration of private Catholic worship. This arrangement spared England from early sectarian warfare and allowed both kingdoms to pursue their economic interests without open conflict. With Spain diplomatically engaged, Elizabeth I turned to France. England's traditional neighbour and occasional rival, she swiftly reaffirmed the existing peace treaty, forging cooperative efforts to counter the Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean and combat Barbary piracy along North Africa's shores. High-profile visits between the two courts restored diplomatic prestige on both sides and generated lucrative trade opportunities. French vessels laden with silk cloth and Chinese porcelain began docking at London ports, invigorating England's domestic silk weaving industry. Artisans in London eagerly studied French weaving techniques, gradually improving the quality and design of English-produced silk goods. The resurgence of international trade under Elizabeth I's stewardship had profound cultural as well as economic effects. Theatres blossomed throughout London, welcoming the debut performances of William Shakespeare's and Christopher Marlowe's newest plays. Book fairs showcased a flood of printed Bibles and Protestant literature, fueling a renaissance of humanist thought and freedom of conscience. The printing presses, once largely silent during the Marian era, roared back to life, facilitating the rapid dissemination of new ideas in theology, science, and philosophy. Literate artisans and merchants eagerly consumed pamphlets and treatises that would shape England's intellectual landscape for decades to come. As customs duties and excise taxes generated substantial revenue, Elizabeth I channeled funds into public works and cultural patronage. The construction of the Royal Exchange in London provided merchants with a centralised forum for trade, reflecting the Crown's commitment to economic development. Universities such as Oxford and Cambridge received grants to expand their libraries and support research, attracting scholars from across Europe. This patronage fostered an environment in which art and science could flourish side by side, laying the foundation for the Golden Age that would soon define the Elizabethan era. Meanwhile, the Queen maintained a shrewd approach to foreign alliances. She dispatched exploration ships to chart new routes along the African coast and across the Atlantic, securing charters for adventurers to establish colonies and trade posts. These ventures promised to bring exotic goods, spices, tobacco, and precious metals into England's markets, further diversifying economic opportunities. Elizabeth I's foreign policy thus combined cautious diplomacy with ambitious maritime expansion, ensuring that England could compete with established powers such as Spain and Portugal without counting exclusively on military confrontation. This blend of commercial revival and diplomatic agility earned Elizabeth I widespread acclaim both at home and abroad. In the Low Countries, merchants praised England's stability and welcomed increased trade, while German financiers provided loans to English trading companies under favourable terms. Venetian ambassadors commended Elizabeth I's prudent leadership, noting that her realm had become a safe harbour for investors and seafarers alike. Such international confidence in England's economic prospects fed back into domestic prosperity. As more entrepreneurs were willing to risk capital on new ventures, the cultural fruits of this economic surge proved extraordinary. Playhouses, once confined to the courtyards of inns, moved into purpose-built theatres like the Globe and the Rose, where audiences of all classes gathered to witness drama that reflected their own hopes and anxieties. Poets and philosophers found new patrons among the rising merchant class, further democratizing the arts. Printed materials from religious tracts to travel narratives flooded bookstalls and private libraries, fostering a literate public eager for knowledge and debate. By the close of the 1660s, Elizabeth I's economic and diplomatic achievements had transformed the kingdom into a thriving hub of commerce and culture. England's navy, bolstered by the funds from revitalized trade, was able to deter piracy and project power offshore. Coastal towns prospered from increased shipping traffic, creating jobs in dockyards and warehouses. Inland, the spread of printed Bibles in English strengthened the bonds between Crown and Commons, as subjects embraced the ideals of a national church moderated by reason and moderation. In retrospect, the recovery of England's economy and the skillful negotiations conducted by Elizabeth I represented a masterful blend of pragmatism and vision. By reconciling warring religious factions, stabilizing internal politics, and forging balanced trade and diplomatic ties, she launched the nation on a course toward unparalleled cultural flourishing. This era of stability, prosperity, and creative innovation would forever be remembered as the golden age of Elizabeth I, an epoch in which commerce and diplomacy worked hand in hand to elevate England onto the world stage. The echoes of Marian persecution left deep, unhealed wounds in English society. Sites once used for public burnings, Smithfield above all became places of solemn remembrance. Protestant congregations gathered annually to pray for the Marian martyrs, ensuring that the memory of those who perished under flames would not fade. Paintings and chronicles preserved harrowing images of victims engulfed by fire, transforming them into enduring symbols of resistance against religious tyranny. These memorials and rituals fostered a collective identity among Protestants, binding communities together in shared grief and conviction. Under Elizabeth I's rule, England gradually developed a dual-structured religious system. The Church of England maintained many Catholic rituals and structures while remaining independent of papal authority, and more radical Protestant sects practiced their faith in private assemblies. This via media approach balanced extremes on both sides. Catholics, discouraged from public worship, could observe their rites discreetly, while Puritans and other reformers found covert spaces to preach their doctrines. By allowing limited toleration, Elizabeth I prevented the resurgence of sectarian violence that had brought the kingdom to the brink under Mary Tudor. The social impact of this religious settlement was equally profound. A burgeoning middle class emerged, fueled by expanding trade and new manufacturing ventures. Town councils, guild workshops, and grammar schools sprang up in market towns and cities alike, providing civic governance, economic opportunity, and education beyond the aristocracy. Noble women and wealthy merchants' daughters attended theological and literary salons, participating in intellectual discussions once reserved for men. Under Elizabeth I's patronage and that of affluent merchants, the revival of Renaissance art, architecture, and music flourished, adorning new civic buildings and private homes with frescoes, stained glass, and madrigal choirs. This religious and social transformation laid the foundations for England's rise as a maritime and economic power. The relative peace fostered by Elizabeth I allowed for safe coastal navigation and encouraged investment in shipbuilding and naval technology. By the following century, English explorers and merchants ventured across the globe, establishing colonies and trade networks that would become the British Empire. Their voyages in search of new markets, spices, and precious metals would also spread elements of English law, language, and culture worldwide. Elizabeth I's policies thus bequeathed a legacy of religious freedom, reconciliation, and socio-economic development. The via media model influenced later debates on toleration, demonstrating that a careful balance between rigid uniformity and unchecked pluralism could maintain public order while respecting individual conscience. The social mobility enabled by the expanded middle class stimulated innovation in finance, commerce, and manufacture, creating the economic resilience necessary for global competition. Cultural life under Elizabeth I thrived in tandem with these shifts. Public theatres, once frowned upon under stricter regimes, became centres of popular entertainment, while universities experimented with new scientific curricula inspired by continental scholars. Prominent figures such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, themselves products of a society confident in commerce and enterprise, exemplified the spirit of exploration and adventure that would define the age. By the year 1620, the religious calm and social dynamism initiated under Elizabeth I's reign had propelled England to new heights. Its merchant fleets plied the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Its financial institutions laid the groundwork for modern capitalism, and its cultural achievements printed books, dramatic literature, and musical compositions endured as hallmarks of the English Renaissance. In retrospect, the religious tolerance and social reforms championed by Elizabeth I after the tragedy of Mary Tudor's reign demonstrate her exceptional governance. By forging a middle path between conflicting extremes, she secured peace and unity. By promoting trade, education, and the arts, she ensured prosperity and innovation. These accomplishments not only healed the wounds of the past, but also charted a course for England's emergence as a leading global power. The legacy of religious freedom, reconciliation, and economic development remains a testament to Elizabeth I. Remarkable skill in statecraft and her enduring impact on world history. The brutal death of Mary Tudor and her blood-soaked reign left profound lessons. Absolute power can easily devolve into fanaticism, and violence never begets true peace. The image of Mary's living body rotting before her court became a harrowing symbol of the price paid for religious extremism. Her fate reminds us that unchecked authority, when wielded in the name of faith, can result in suffering that outlasts the victims and stains a nation's conscience. In English history, Mary Tudor occupies a divided place. She was a woman who endured grave injustices from an early age, maintaining unshakable devotion to her beliefs, yet ultimately allowing her wounds to transform her into a merciless ruler. Modern historians critique her inability to pursue reconciliation and her reliance on harsh punishment. Mary's story warns that personal trauma, when left unhealed, can fester into cruelty rather than compassion, turning a leader's faith into a tool of oppression. Although her religious policies were swiftly overturned under Elizabeth I, the fear and trauma of the Marian burnings proved far harder to eradicate. Letters, diaries, and pamphlets from the period document the horrors experienced by ordinary citizens, accounts of neighbours seized in the night, and lectures watched under penalty of death. These primary sources remain invaluable for scholars studying collective psychology and the dynamics of state-sponsored persecution. The collective memory of those atrocities informed successive debates on religious toleration, illustrating humanity's need to remember past abuses to prevent their recurrence. Mary Tudor's medical ordeal also contributed to the annals of health history. Detailed accounts of her symptoms, massive edema, cutaneous necrosis, intestinal twisting, and large malignant tumors provide rare insights into the progression of what modern medicine identifies as gynecological cancer. While no cure existed at the time, these descriptions laid the groundwork for later oncological research. By cataloguing each stage of her illness, physicians inadvertently created a case study that would inform centuries of study, underscoring the importance of meticulous clinical observation, even in an era lacking effective treatments. Beyond medicine and memory, Mary's narrative underscores a timeless principle: the need to balance authority and belief with tolerance and wisdom. When leaders prioritize revenge over mercy, they risk perpetuating cycles of violence that scar both individuals and communities. Mary's transformation from persecuted princess to persecutor herself highlights how power can magnify personal pain into collective tyranny. Her reign serves as a sober reminder that vengeance, cloaked in piety, often conceals the unhealed wounds of the avenger. In the aftermath of her death, England's swift return to religious moderation under Elizabeth I demonstrated a collective desire to move beyond fanaticism. Yet the legacy of Marian persecution persisted in literature, law, and oral tradition. The persistence of Marian martyr commemorations well into the next century shows how deeply those events imprinted themselves on the national psyche. Such commemorations exemplified a form of ritualized remembrance that both honored the past and cautioned future generations about the perils of zealotry. Mary Tudor's story also left a mark on artistic and theological discourse. Writers and preachers invoked her example to argue for moderation and restraint. In subsequent centuries, church councils and political philosophers referred to the Marian era when drafting guidelines on religious freedom and the separation of church and state. The memory of her violent policies informed the development of legal protections for conscience, contributing to the philosophical foundations of religious liberty that would emerge in the Enlightenment. Moreover, Mary's personal journey from the earliest days as the Pearl of England through humiliation, exile, and vengeance offers a case study in the psychology of trauma and power. Modern psychological research on post-traumatic stress and the potential for trauma to fuel aggression can trace early examples to her life. By examining how unaddressed emotional wounds influenced her decisions, scholars gain a deeper understanding of the interplay between personal vulnerability and political behavior. Finally, the cautionary tale of Mary Tudor reminds us of the fragility of earthly power and the inevitability of mortality. In her rotting flesh, the queen who had once judged others found herself helpless before a disease she could neither command nor reason. Her story reinforces a universal truth: no throne can shield one from suffering, and no crown can guarantee immunity from death. Through the lens of her tragic end, we are reminded that compassion and humility must temper authority, lest it devolve into cruelty. Mary Tudor's legacy, therefore, is twofold: a stark warning of the destructive potential of fanatical leadership, and an enduring testament to the resilience of human memory and conscience. Her reign illustrates how swiftly honor can turn to horror when power is unchecked by empathy. Yet by studying her life and downfall, successive generations have drawn vital lessons on governance, tolerance, and the sanctity of human dignity, ensuring that the painful history of Mary Tudor continues to inform and guide us toward a more compassionate future. The medical records from Queen Mary Tudor's era, although rudimentary, became exceptionally valuable resources for future scholars and physicians. Detailed descriptions of symptoms such as abdominal edema, cutaneous necrosis, jaundice, and unrelenting pain provided an accurate depiction of advanced gynecological cancer. In the decades immediately following her death, European medical schools incorporated these first-hand accounts into their curricula to distinguish between various cancers and infectious diseases. Lecturers used Mary Tudor's case to illustrate how malignant growths invade surrounding tissues and to emphasize the importance of careful clinical observation. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as modern medicine began to take shape. English anatomists relied on royal journals and diplomatic correspondence to compare descriptions of Mary's liver and uterine lesions with actual pathological specimens. They noted how tumours replaced healthy tissue, compressing adjacent organs and disrupting bodily functions. While curative treatments remained unavailable, these pioneering efforts in staging the disease and documenting its progression laid essential groundwork for later oncological research. Mary Tudor's case thus served as one of the earliest comprehensive clinical records of cancer's natural history, guiding future generations of physicians in their understanding of tumour biology. Mary Tudor's ordeal also exemplified the broader medical crisis of the medieval and early Renaissance periods, during which treatments were based more on tradition than on scientific evidence. Practices such as bloodletting, primitive acupuncture, and unverified herbal concoctions were applied indiscriminately. These interventions often weakened patients further rather than curing them. For modern medicine, Mary Tudor's story became a cautionary tale. The critical need to abandon unproven methods in favour of approaches validated by systematic research. By highlighting the catastrophic outcomes of trial-and-error therapies, her case underscored the imperative that medical practice be grounded in empirical data. Moreover, Mary Tudor's protracted suffering highlighted the importance of early diagnosis and palliative care. Her repeated hospitalizations and painful interventions drew attention to what is now recognized as compassionate end-of-life treatment. Although her physicians could not halt her disease, their detailed notes on pain management and wound care informed later developments in supportive medicine. Mary's case thus contributed to evolving standards for patient comfort, laying a foundation for the modern discipline of palliative care that prioritizes quality of life even when a cure is not possible. In 1950, London's Medical Museum organised an exhibition titled Royal Maladies Through the Ages, featuring Mary Tudor's original manuscripts as focal artefacts. Visitors, particularly medical students, viewed the handwritten pages inked in dark Gothic script, feeling a profound connection to the Queen's desperate search for relief. The exhibit underscored her unwavering desire for life and illuminated the human dimension often lost in purely academic studies. By presenting these historical documents alongside contemporary medical displays, the museum inspired a wave of interest in the history of medicine and pathology. This exhibition had a lasting impact on medical education. Universities in Britain and beyond began offering courses in medical history, recognizing that understanding past errors and insights enriches current clinical practice. Mary Tudor's case, in particular, became required reading for students specializing in oncology and gynecology. By examining the evolution of diagnostic criteria and therapeutic techniques from her time to the present, trainees gained perspective on the progress medicine has achieved and the challenges that remain. The scholarly attention Mary Tudor's records received also prompted international collaboration. Archives in Madrid, Paris, and Amsterdam shared copies of related documents, enabling comparative studies of early modern medical practices across Europe. Researchers identified common patterns in descriptions of advanced cancer, unearthing how cultural factors influenced medical interpretation and treatment choices. These cross-border studies contributed to the global understanding of cancer epidemiology and the development of standardized pathological classifications beyond academic circles. Mary Tudor's medical legacy resonated with the broader public. Biographies and historical documentaries highlighted her illness as emblematic of the vulnerability shared by all people, regardless of status. This humanizing portrayal helped dismantle the notion that royalty was immune to common physical afflictions. Fundraisers and charity events sometimes invoked her story to raise awareness and support for cancer research, channeling historical sympathy into contemporary philanthropy. In this way, Mary Tudor's suffering transcended the pages of history to benefit real-world medical advances. In the late 20th century, the digitization of archival materials further magnified Mary Tudor's impact on medical scholarship. Digital libraries made her manuscripts accessible worldwide, allowing scholars from diverse fields, historians, oncologists, and anthropologists, to analyze her case from multiple perspectives. Such interdisciplinary research fostered innovative methodologies, linking literary analysis of her personal letters with statistical studies of historical cancer mortality rates. Mary Tudor's case thus exemplified the power of open-access archives in driving new insights across academic disciplines. Ultimately, the medical legacy of Mary Tudor demonstrates the enduring value of meticulous documentation. Her case bridged the gap between medieval practices and modern oncology, illustrating how early clinical observations can seed decades of scientific progress. By preserving her records, successive generations ensured that the lessons of her tragic illness would inform advancements in diagnosis, treatment, and compassionate care. Mary Tudor's experience remains a testament to the critical importance of combining empirical rigor with humanity in the practice of medicine, reminding us that each patient's story can illuminate paths toward better health for all. Over centuries, the story of Mary Tudor seeped into the folklore of England as a chilling legend. The old St. James's Palace, once her residence, came to be regarded as a haunted site where the restless spirit of the deposed queen lingered. Visitors occasionally report a sudden chill running down their spine and a fleeting sight of a sorrowful woman in white, her eyes hollow with regret, gliding down empty corridors. These inexplicable encounters have fueled local lore and drawn curiosity seekers, hoping to glimpse the spectral monarch. Legend holds that on the night of the 17th of November each year, an anniversary of Mary Tudor's death, the wind whistles through the palace's ancient doors and windows, carrying a plaintive sigh that seems to call, "O child, forgive me." Folk storytellers use this haunting refrain as a moral lesson on the cruelty of fanaticism and the redemptive power of forgiveness. Pilgrims often journey to the nearby St. James's Church before this fateful date, lighting candles and offering prayers to soothe the Queen's tormented soul. They believe that only true compassion can release her from the anguish that binds her spirit to the earthly realm. Beyond verbal tales, Mary Tudor's legend found expression in popular art forms, from short stories and masked dramas to naive watercolor paintings. In these works, she is portrayed not merely as a ruthless monarch, but as a tragic figure ensnared by destiny. Writers and poets explored her profound loneliness, the fracture of her faith, and her desperate yearning for redemption. Ballads recounted her suffering, while plays staged her spectral wanderings through moonlit halls, inviting audiences to reflect on the human cost of power unchecked by mercy. Among the most enduring folk creations is the ballad known as The Queen's Sorrowful Lament. Still sung in Cornwall and Yorkshire, this mournful tune unfolds in a slow, dirge-like tempo, the lyrics evoking the Queen's gaunt, yellowed visage, and the soft lullaby that alternately chills and breaks the heart. Villagers gather each autumn festival to perform this song before old tombstones in churchyards, commemorating both the pain of the past and the imperative lesson it imparts to later generations. They believe that by honouring Mary Tudor's memory in this way, they preserve the truth of her tragic life and guard against repeating her mistakes. In rural inns and public houses, storytellers embellish details with each retelling. Some claim that Mary's ghost is accompanied by the flicker of a candle that never expires, hovering just out of reach on a dusty windowsill. Others speak of hearing her anguished sigh beneath the breath of wind, as though the palace itself mourns her demise. Children are warned not to wander near the old palace grounds after dusk, lest they tempt the vengeful spirit of a queen who once judged them all. These folk legends have also entered the canon of English Gothic literature. 17th and 18th century pamphleteers spun elaborate tales of Mary Tudor's phantom leading unsuspecting travellers into secret passages beneath Whitehall, only for them to emerge confused at dawn miles away in the countryside. These tall tales, though lacking historical foundation, speak to the enduring fascination with Mary's life and death, and the broader cultural impulse to use supernatural narrative as a means of grappling with collective trauma. Even contemporary artists draw inspiration from these legends, Local painters capture spectral scenes of a lone figure in a faded crimson robe, wandering among crumbling columns. Poets compose verses imagining Mary's reflections as she searches for atonement, her lament echoing through time. Such creative works keep her story alive, ensuring that the lessons of her reign resonate in the modern era. Annual reenactments at heritage sites dramatize key moments from Mary Tudor's life, her proclamation as queen, the phantom pregnancies, and her final days of suffering. Actors in period costume recreate the sounds of crackling flames and the anguished cries of those condemned, culminating in a silent vigil at a makeshift grave marked by an empty chair. This performative ritual blends historical education with communal remembrance, inviting participants to confront the darker chapters of England's past in a respectful, contemplative setting. Local historians maintain walking tours that trace Mary Tudor's footsteps through London's winding streets. Guides recount the scenes of her childhood at Greenwich Palace, her trials under Henry VIII, and the locations of her public proclamations and decrees. The final stop often lies at the remains of St. Public.O, James's Palace, where the guide pauses to share first-hand accounts of ghostly sightings and the annual lullaby of the wind. Tour participants leave with a heightened awareness of how history and legend intertwine, shaping collective memory and identity. Ultimately, the folk legends surrounding Mary Tudor underscore a universal truth. That memory, whether preserved in official chronicles or whispered in village inns, carries the power to teach and to caution. Through stories of her suffering and spectral presence, communities across England remind themselves of the perils of religious zealotry and the necessity of mercy. Mary Tudor's posthumous voice, carried on the wind through ancient palace halls, persists as a mourner's plea and a timeless admonition that forgiveness, not fire, must guide the hearts of rulers and the compassion of their people. Looking back through a modern lens, in the 21st century, Mary Tudor is viewed through a far more nuanced prism, as a woman deeply traumatized from her earliest years, who ultimately became both a symbol and a product of historical tragedy. Contemporary feminist scholars point out that Mary endured both gendered and political oppression, her subsequent fanaticism evolving into a form of self-defense against a world that had repeatedly betrayed her. Documentaries and dramatic films produced in recent decades explore not only the harsh political realities of her reign, but also the intense physical and psychological suffering she endured. These visual narratives invite today's audiences to engage more fully with the societal context of Tudor England, the rigid hierarchies, the relentless court intrigues, and the crushing expectations placed upon a female monarch. In educational settings, Mary Tudor's story has been incorporated into history curricula as a vivid case study of the consequences of religious extremism and the importance of freedom of conscience. Students analyze her persecution of Protestant dissenters alongside the failure of contemporary medicine to treat her and, by extension, examine the parallels with current debates over medical ethics and access to care. At the University of London, the course Medical History Through Royal Case Studies integrates Mary Tudor's case into lectures that combine historical analysis, clinical medicine, and social science. Undergraduates investigate the evolution of cancer diagnostics, compare 16th century treatments with modern oncology, and consider how gender and political power intersected to influence her medical care. On social media and professional forums, the hashtag Bloody Mary resurfaces regularly as scholars, artists, and activists share research articles, reinterpretations of her portraiture, and short films that dramatize her physical decline. Podcasts devoted to historical inquiry frequently invite oncologists, psychologists, and theologians to discuss the multifaceted roots of Mary Tudor's personal suffering, from the role of childhood trauma in her mental health to the societal pressures that shaped her religious policies. These digital platforms enable an international academic community to convene in virtual seminars trading insights into how Mary's experience informs modern understandings of leadership, trauma, and collective memory. International scholarly conferences now routinely feature panels on Mary Tudor as a multidisciplinary subject. Historians probe primary sources, letters, court records, medical notes, while physicians interpret her symptoms through the lens of contemporary medical knowledge. Literary scholars examine how Tudor propaganda and later dramatizations have perpetuated certain myths about her character. Sociologists and anthropologists consider how public memory of the Marian persecutions has influenced later attitudes toward religious tolerance. Through these conversations, Mary Tudor emerges as more than a footnote in Tudor history. She becomes a case study in the interplay between personal injury and public policy, illustrating how unchecked authority and unaddressed trauma can combine with devastating effect. Moreover, Mary Tudor's life has inspired critical reflection on the ethics of historical interpretation itself. Scholars debate the extent to which her personal suffering can mitigate or explain her decisions as a monarch. Does knowledge of her childhood exile and psychological distress offer an excuse for the harshness of her reign? Or does it simply underscore the tragic dimensions of her character? These questions animate seminars in history and philosophy departments, prompting students to grapple with the moral complexity of judging historical figures by modern standards, while remaining mindful of the social norms of their time. Artistic reinterpretations also reflect this modern lens. Contemporary composers have set texts drawn from Mary's prayers and letters to music, creating oratorios that evoke her anguish and resolve. Visual artists have exhibited portraits of Mary that emphasize her human vulnerability, a tear-streaked face rendered in chiaroscuro, a robed figure, frail, yet defiant against a backdrop of funeral pyres. These creative works aim to humanize Mary Tudor, inviting audiences to empathize with her as a woman shaped by forces beyond her control, rather than simply condemn her as a tyrant. In public history, venues such as museums and heritage sites, interactive exhibits allow visitors to explore the medical instruments of the 16th century, examine replicas of Tudor-era herbal remedies, and listen to dramatized readings of Mary's own words. Augmented reality experiences reconstruct the sensory environment of St. Elaine, James's palace at the end of her life. The flickering of candlelight over decaying tapestries, the distant murmur of court officials debating her fitness to rule, and the interior ache of a queen betrayed by both body and spirit. By engaging multiple senses, these exhibits bring Mary's story to life. For a 21st century audience conditioned to immersive learning, Mary Tudor's legacy also resonates in debates over contemporary religious and political extremism. Advocacy groups often reference the Marian burnings as a cautionary parallel when condemning modern instances of persecution carried out in the name of faith or ideology. Her life underscores how zealotry, when sanctioned by the state, can spiral into barbarism, eroding the moral authority of those who wield power. The lesson is echoed in policy discussions around religious freedom and hate crime legislation, where Mary's example is cited as historical evidence for the necessity of robust legal protections for minority beliefs. Finally, Mary Tudor's story reminds us that the passage of time does not guarantee understanding or forgiveness. The process of re-examining her life in the 21st century is ongoing, with new documents and interpretations continually emerging. Each generation adds layers to her portrait: a queen tormented by illness, a ruler consumed by her quest for religious purity, and ultimately, a human being caught in the merciless machinery of history. In this way, Mary Tudor's life and death transcend the confines of the Tudor era, offering enduring insights into the human condition, the perils of absolutism, and the healing power of empathy. By viewing Mary Tudor through this modern lens, one that embraces gender analysis, medical science, ethical reflection, and creative reinterpretation, we gain a richer appreciation of her as both a tragic figure and a complex historical agent. Her legacy challenges us to acknowledge the shadows in history without reducing her to a mere symbol of cruelty. Instead, we confront the full spectrum of her humanity, learning from her sufferings and missteps as we strive to build a world in which power is tempered by compassion and tragedy by understanding. The story of Mary Tudor, from the heights of royal privilege to the depths of excruciating suffering, carries a powerful message about the limits of authority, the fragility of the human body, and the danger inherent when faith degenerates into fanaticism. Once the pampered princess, Mary became a haunting spectre in her own palace. Once the judge who sentenced heretics to the flames, she ultimately found herself consumed by the internal fire of her own disease. Her dramatic fall reveals that power unchecked by compassion can destroy both ruler and realm. For modern audiences, Mary Tudor's life offers a clear lesson in humanitarianism and reconciliation. Authority must be tempered by mercy, medicine guided by science and empathy, and religion embraced as a source of solace rather than an instrument of oppression. When we face injustice, we should not allow hatred to drive us towards senseless violence. Instead, we must remember that redress built on understanding heals more effectively than retribution built on fear. On a personal level, Mary's tragedy reminds us that psychological wounds inflicted in childhood can have far-reaching consequences. Every trauma, every betrayal deserves acknowledgement and care. Compressing grief and anger beneath a veneer of strength risks turning private pain into public tragedy. Empathy and emotional support, bolstered by medical knowledge and mental health resources, are essential to help individuals transcend suffering rather than be consumed by it. Moreover, Mary Tudor's agonizing final months underscore the imperative of integrating scientific rigor into medical practice. Her physicians followed the best protocols of their era: bloodletting, purgatives, herbal remedies, but without evidence-based methods. Their efforts wrought more harm than good. Today, her case serves as a stark reminder that compassionate care must go hand in hand with rigorous research, ensuring that patients receive treatments proven to alleviate suffering and extend life rather than perpetuate agony. At the societal level, Mary's reign illustrates the perils of conflating religious zeal with state power. When doctrinal conformity becomes a litmus test for loyalty, persecution inevitably follows. Modern societies that value pluralism and human rights owe a debt to those who suffered under regimes of intolerance. By commemorating their stories, we reaffirm the principle that freedom of conscience and freedom of worship must be protected against political intrusion. Ultimately, the account of Mary Tudor reminds us that history is more than a chronicle of events. It is the record of real people experiencing real pain. When we recount Mary's life as if it were a somber bedtime story, we invite listeners to drift into reflection. Yet at the same time, we awaken them to the preciousness of life itself. Precious freedom, precious compassion, precious faith, grounded in love rather than fear. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Mary Tudor's life and legacy. If you're still awake, sleep well. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss our newest and most engaging content. Good night.